Picture this. It is the year 1288. You are standing on the deck of a massive warship drifting down the Bạch Đằng River in what is now northern Vietnam. You are a soldier of the Yuan dynasty, a warrior of the great Mongol Empire. You have conquered the steppes of Central Asia, you have burned the cities of Eastern Europe, and you have crushed the Song dynasty of China. You are part of the most terrifying military machine the world has ever seen. You are invincible. The water is calm. The morning fog is lifting. You are retreating home, frustrated but alive, convinced that the war is over. Suddenly the ship lurches. A sound like a thunderclap rips through the wooden hull beneath your feet. It isn't the sound of an enemy ram. It's the sound of the river bottom itself rising up to stab you. You are thrown forward, your face smashing into the railing. You look over the side, expecting to see a sandbar. Instead, you see a nightmare. As the tide rushes out with supernatural speed, thousands of iron-tipped wooden stakes, thick as tree trunks, are erupting from the water like the teeth of a subterranean monster. Your ship is impaled. Behind you, 400 other ships are crashing into each other, creating a logjam of panic and splintered wood. You aren't fighting an army, you're fighting a trap that was set months ago, timed to the exact second of the retreating tide. The water turns red, not from the sunset, but from the blood of 80,000 men. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer insanity of this moment, you have to understand the scale of the monster that was bleeding out in that river. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire wasn't just a country, it was a force of nature. Under Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, they had swallowed half the known world. They had normalized the apocalypse. When the Mongols arrived, you didn't just lose a war, your civilization was deleted. They had the best cavalry, the most advanced siege engineers, and a resource base that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube. To them, Vietnam, or Đại Việt as it was known, was nothing. It was a mosquito buzzing around the ear of a tiger. It was a tiny, humid strip of land that refused to die. Kublai Khan had sent his son, Prince Togan, and a massive fleet to crush this annoyance once and for all. He sent 500 ships. He sent hundreds of thousands of men. He expected a quick surrender. Instead, he walked into a meat grinder. Most history books will tell you that the Mongols failed because of the heat or tropical diseases. That is a lie. That is a comforting excuse used by empires to explain away their humiliation. The truth is much darker and much more impressive. The Mongols didn't lose to the weather, they lost to a masterclass in physics and psychology. They were defeated by a Vietnamese general named Trần Hưng Đạo, a man who looked at the Mongol war machine and realized he couldn't beat them with muscle. He had to beat them with gravity. He had to weaponize the moon. The Battle of Bạch Đằng wasn't just a military victory. It was an engineering miracle executed in the middle of a war zone. It proved that if you know your land better than the enemy knows his own sword, you can turn a river into a guillotine. To appreciate the sheer absurdity of what happened in that river, you first have to understand the monster that was trying to cross it. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire wasn't just a superpower, it was a force of cosmic inevitability. If history is a video game, the Mongols were playing with cheat codes. They had conquered the Jin dynasty, obliterated the Xia, and dismantled the Islamic Khwarezmian Empire. They had ridden their horses into the cathedrals of Poland and Hungary. They had just finished destroying the Song dynasty in China, a civilization that was centuries ahead of Europe in technology and culture. When the Mongols wanted a city, they didn't just take it. If you resisted, they depopulated it. They turned thriving metropolises into grazing pastures. They were the apex predators of the medieval world, and Kublai Khan was the alpha. Kublai wasn't just a warlord living in a tent anymore. He was the emperor of the Yuan dynasty. He sat on a throne in Beijing, ruling over the largest contiguous land empire in human history. He was the master of the Silk Road, the landlord of the world. But he had a problem. To the south, there was this annoying, stubborn strip of jungle and mountains called Đại Việt. On the map, it looked insignificant. It was a rounding error in his tax ledger. But to Kublai, it was an obsession. He had tried to invade it twice before, in 1258 and 1285. Both times his armies had been humiliated, not destroyed but frustrated. They had been beaten by the heat, the diseases, and a people who simply refused to stand still and die like they were supposed to. For this third invasion in 1287, Kublai wasn't playing around. He was done with diplomacy. He was done with small expeditionary forces. He authorized a rage-quit army. He sent Prince Togun back with an overwhelming force, infantry, cavalry, and a massive naval fleet to supply them. The strategy was simple: brute force. If the Vietnamese wouldn't kneel, he would burn the entire country down to the bedrock and repopulate it with people who knew how to follow orders. The Mongol army was a terrifying machine. Their horse archers could shoot a bird out of the sky while riding at full gallop. Their heavy cavalry was encased in iron scales. They were an army built for speed, shock, and open plains. But here is where the brilliance of the Vietnamese resistance begins. They knew exactly what the Mongols were. They knew they couldn't fight this enemy in a fair fight. If you meet the Mongols on an open field, you lose. That is a law of physics. The Vietnamese commanders looked at this encroaching tidal wave of iron and decided to do something counterintuitive. They didn't build a wall. They didn't mass their armies at the border for a glorious last stand. They looked at the terrain, the suffocating humidity, the dense jungles, the network of rivers that sliced up the land like a broken mirror, and they realized that the land itself was their only ally. The Mongols were the masters of the steppe, but in the swamp, a Ferrari is useless. The Vietnamese prepared to play a different game entirely. They weren't going to fight the Mongols. They were going to let the Mongols fight Vietnam. When Prince Togun's army finally smashed through the defensive lines and marched into the capital of Thang Long, modern-day Hanoi, he expected the usual rewards of conquest. In the medieval playbook, capturing the capital meant the war was over. You ride in, you slaughter the resistance, you loot the treasury, and you feast on the enemy's food. It is a release of tension. It is the payout. Togun rode through the gates ready to bathe the streets in blood, but he found something arguably worse than an army waiting for him. He found absolutely nothing. The city was a ghost town. The palaces were stripped bare. The granaries were swept clean. There were no people to torture for information, no rice to steal, and no livestock to butcher. The Vietnamese hadn't just retreated, they had evaporated. This was the empty garden, empty house strategy, a scorched earth policy taken to its psychological extreme. Trần Hưng Đạo knew that the Mongol war machine ran on momentum. It was a fire that needed constant fuel, loot, food, and violence to keep burning. By removing the fuel, he wasn't just denying them resources, he was denying them a victory. He forced the most powerful army on earth to punch smoke. Picture the frustration of a Mongol soldier in 1288. You have marched thousands of miles. You are wearing heavy armor in a tropical jungle that feels like a steam room. You are covered in leeches, you are dehydrated, and you are dreaming of the plunder you were promised. Instead, you are standing in an empty city, shouting at walls. And then the real enemy arrives, not a soldier with a spear, but a rumbling in your stomach. An army of 500,000 men and horses is a biological logistical nightmare. It requires tons of food every single day just to exist. Without local supplies to raid, the clock starts ticking. The Mongols were stuck. They controlled the capital, but they controlled nothing. Every time they sent out foraging parties to find food in the countryside, those small groups would be ambushed by local militias and disappear into the jungle. They were bleeding out from 1,000 paper cuts. The heat was rotting their bowstrings. Tropical diseases were liquefying their intestines. The glorious conquest had turned into a humid, starving purgatory. Togun realized too late that he hadn't captured a city. He had walked into a prison cell. He was the master of a kingdom of dirt. His only hope lay in the water. The Mongol invasion plan relied on a massive supply fleet trailing behind the army, carrying thousands of tons of grain. Togun was waiting for these ships to arrive and save his starving legions. He looked at the Red River every day, praying to see the sails of his supply commander, Omar. But those ships were never going to arrive. While Togun was starving in the empty capital, the Vietnamese were systematically hunting down his lifeline. The war had shifted from the land, where the Mongols were kings, to the water, where they were about to become prey. To pull off a miracle, you need more than just a clever plan. You need a psychopath's level of conviction. In 1288, the Vietnamese court was vibrating with fear. You have to remember, the Mongols weren't just an army, they were the apocalypse. Surrender was a very logical option. Many of the king's advisors were whispering that it was better to be a living vassal than a dead rebel. They looked at the scorched cities and the starving population, and they saw the end of the world. But standing between the wavering king and total capitulation was the supreme commander, Trần Hưng Đạo. Trần Hưng Đạo is often depicted in statues as a stoic, bearded sage pointing into the distance. But make no mistake, this man was not a passive philosopher. He was a creature of absolute, cold pragmatism. When the king, terrified by the sheer scale of the Mongol horde, asked him if they should surrender to save the people from further slaughter, Trần Hưng Đạo didn't offer a comforting speech. He handed the king his sword and said, "If you want to surrender, your majesty, you must cut off my head first." It wasn't a bluff, it was a contract. He was effectively saying that as long as he had a pulse, the war would continue. He was the anchor that stopped the entire nation from drifting into submission. But his genius wasn't just in his bravery, it was in his understanding of human psychology. He knew his officers were tired, he knew they were rich, soft, and terrified of losing their wealth to the Mongol looters. So he wrote one of the most brutal pieces of military literature in history, the Proclamation to the Officers. This wasn't a "I have a dream" speech, it was a "wake up and look at the knife at your throat" speech. He didn't appeal to their hope, he appealed to their shame. He explicitly called them out for enjoying their comforts, listening to music, drinking wine, and betting on cockfights, while the enemy was sharpening blades to butcher them. He asked them, "When the Mongols come, will your fighting cocks save you? Will your gambling debts buy your life?" He painted a graphic picture of their future, their wives seized, their ancestral tombs dug up and desecrated, their families enslaved. He told them that if they didn't fight, he would personally make sure their names were humiliated for eternity. It was a masterclass in dark psychology. He terrified his own men more than the Mongols did. The result was electric. It triggered a kind of collective hysteria, but the useful kind. The soldiers didn't just agree to fight. They tattooed 2 words onto their arms. Sat that. Death to the Tartars. This wasn't just ink, it was a blood oath. Trần Hưng Đạo had transformed a ragtag group of terrified conscripts and tired nobles into a suicidal cult dedicated to the destruction of the Yuan dynasty. He knew that to defeat a monster, you have to become something the monster fears. You have to become a people who have already accepted death. With the army's mind finally broken and reshaped into a weapon, Trần Hưng Đạo was ready to stop retreating. He looked at the map, pointed to the Bạch Đằng River, and decided that this was where the chase would end. The Battle of Bạch Đằng wasn't won by soldiers, it was won by hydrologists. Trần Hưng Đạo looked at the map and realized that the Bạch Đằng River wasn't just a body of water, it was a machine. It was a tidal estuary, which means its depth changed drastically, depending on the time of day and the phase of the moon. This was the key. He didn't need to match the Mongol fleet ship for ship. He just needed to control the vertical space. He needed to turn the river into a floor of spikes, but he needed that floor to be invisible until the exact moment of impact. This wasn't a military operation anymore. It was an industrial construction project carried out in total secrecy. Trần Hưng Đạo ordered his men to the forest. They didn't cut down small saplings. They felled massive ironwood trees, dense, heavy timber that sinks in water and is as hard as stone. They stripped these trunks down to their cores, sharpened them into lethal points, capped them with iron. These weren't just sticks. They were anti-ship missiles before the invention of gunpowder. But the genius wasn't in the stakes themselves, it was in the placement. The Vietnamese engineers had to calculate the tidal charts with a terrifying degree of precision. They studied the lunar cycles, they knew exactly how high the water would rise at high tide and exactly how low it would drop at low tide. The margin for error was 0. If they planted the stakes too deep, the Mongol ships would float right over them even at low tide. If they planted them too shallow, the Mongols would see them at high tide and simply steer around. They had to find the Goldilocks zone of death. For weeks, thousands of Vietnamese soldiers and locals worked in the freezing mud, often at night, driving these massive pilings into the riverbed. They created 3 distinct fields of stakes, arranged in a V shape to funnel the enemy ships into a central kill zone. Imagine the physical labor involved here. They were hauling tons of timber into a rushing river, hammering them into the silt, and praying that no Mongol scout boat would float by and see what they were doing. They were effectively building a minefield, but the trigger wasn't a pressure plate. It was the moon. When they were finished, the trap was invisible. At high tide, the dark, silty water of the Bạch Đằng River flowed over the tops of the stakes, hiding them completely. To the naked eye, it looked like open water. It looked like an escape route. But just a few feet below the surface, thousands of iron-tipped spears were waiting, angled upstream, ready to gut the hulls of any ship that tried to pass. Trần Hưng Đạo had converted the geography of Vietnam into a weapon. Now all he had to do was wait for the tide to turn and lure the most powerful fleet on earth into the mouth of the beast. By early April 1288, the trap was dug, the stakes were set, and the stage was ready. Now Trần Hưng Đạo had to solve the hardest part of the equation, cooperation. A trap is useless if the victim walks around it. He needed the Mongol fleet, commanded by the brutal and experienced General Omar, to sail into the Bạch Đằng River at the exact moment of high tide. If they arrived too early, they would see the stakes. If they arrived too late, the water would be too low for the trap to work. He needed to synchronize the movements of an enemy army with the rotation of the earth. General Omar wasn't an idiot. He was a veteran of naval warfare who had crushed the Song dynasty. He was currently retreating, his ships laden with supplies and tired soldiers, desperate to get back to the open ocean and sail home. He was cautious. He knew the Vietnamese were lurking in the mangroves. To get a man like that to commit suicide, you have to target his ego, you have to insult him. On the morning of April 9th, as the Mongol fleet approached the river mouth, they didn't see a wall of battleships. They saw a handful of small, lightweight Vietnamese vessels drifting out of the fog. These boats looked pathetic. They were small, fragile, and seemingly manned by a skeleton crew. It was a taunt. To the Mongol commanders, standing on the decks of their towering war junks, this looked like a last, desperate attempt by a dying nation to take a potshot at the retreating conquerors. Trần Hưng Đạo ordered his men to attack, but not to win. They fired arrows, shouted insults, and then, the moment the Mongols turned their heavy ships to engage, the Vietnamese turned tail and ran. This was the feigned retreat, the oldest trick in the military playbook, used by everyone from the Spartans to Genghis Khan himself. The irony is palpable. The Mongols, the masters of the feigned retreat on land, were about to fall for it on water. Omar took the bait. The sight of these small, annoying ships fleeing in terror triggered a predatory instinct. He signaled the fleet to pursue. He wanted to crush these pests before leaving Vietnamese waters forever. The Mongol ships, heavy and cumbersome, broke formation to chase the lighter Vietnamese vessels. They picked up speed, their oars churning the water, their sails catching the wind. They roared into the mouth of the Bạch Đằng River. Crucially, the tide was high, the water was swollen and deep, covering the iron-tipped stakes by several meters. To the Mongol navigators, the river looked wide, safe, and navigable. They couldn't see the forest of death waiting beneath the keel. They sailed right over the trap, pushing deeper and deeper into the estuary, convinced they were chasing a routed enemy. Trần Hưng Đạo watched from the riverbanks, hidden in the foliage. He wasn't looking at the enemy ships. He was watching the waterline. He was waiting for the tide to turn. The Mongols had just sailed into a bottle, and Trần Hưng Đạo was holding the cork. 1 minute, they were the predators. 1 minute they were the predators, surging forward on a deep, navigable river, closing in for the kill. The next minute, the laws of physics began to conspire against them. The water level didn't just drop, it plummeted. The Bạch Đằng River is notorious for its aggressive tidal shifts, and Trần Hưng Đạo had timed this down to the minute. Suddenly the lead ships stopped moving. They didn't hit a sandbar, they hit something hard, sharp, and immovable. A sickening grinding noise echoed across the water, the sound of iron tearing through wood. The massive Mongol war junks, heavy with supplies and horses, had been speeding downstream with the current. When their bottoms caught the hidden stakes, inertia did the rest. The ships impaled themselves. They were gutted from the bottom up. The soldiers on deck were thrown off their feet as the vessels shuddered to a violent halt. But the real horror was happening behind them. The ships in the rear didn't know the ships in the front had stopped. They kept coming. Driven by the wind and the rushing current, they slammed into the backs of their own comrades. It was a chain reaction pileup on a massive scale. Wood splintered, masts snapped like twigs, and men were crushed between hulls. The river, which had been a highway moments ago, instantly transformed into a parking lot of destruction. Then the water receded further. And this is where the genius of the trap truly reveals itself. As the tide rushed out to sea, the water level dropped below the tops of the stakes. The Mongol ships weren't just stuck, they were suspended, they were pinned in place, tilted at crazy angles, completely immobilized. A ship that cannot move is not a warship. It is a coffin. The Vietnamese bait ships, the ones that had been fleeing in terror, suddenly stopped running. They turned around. The sound of drums began to thunder from the riverbanks. From the dense reeds and the hidden tributaries, thousands of small, agile Vietnamese boats swarmed out like wasps. They weren't impeded by the stakes. Their drafts were shallow. They could weave through the chaos while the Mongol giants were paralyzed. Inside the Mongol ships, panic turned into madness. You have to understand the claustrophobia. You are trapped on a sinking wooden island. The river is rushing past you, draining away your only hope of escape. You can't swim because you are wearing heavy lamella armor that acts as an anchor. You can't fight back because the enemy is circling you in small boats, peppering you with arrows and firebombs, staying just out of reach of your boarding planks. The Mongols were the greatest warriors on earth when they had space to maneuver. But here, pinned on spikes in a muddy river, they were helpless. The trap had snapped shut, and the slaughter was about to begin. Once the ships were pinned, Trần Hưng Đạo didn't send in boarding parties to fight hand-to-hand. That would be a waste of good Vietnamese lives. He sent fire. This is where the trap turns from a military ambush into a scene from Dante's Inferno. The Vietnamese had prepared hundreds of small rafts loaded with dry straw, oil and gunpowder. They lit them up and set them adrift. Guided by the wind and the remaining current, these floating bombs drifted aimlessly, beautifully, right into the paralyzed cluster of Mongol ships. Wood, canvas, tar and panic. These are the ingredients of a firestorm. When the first rafts collided with the Mongol hulls, the fire didn't just catch, it exploded. You have to remember, these ships were jammed together so tightly that you could walk across the river on their decks. That meant the fire could walk across them too. The flames jumped from ship to ship with terrifying speed. The Yuan fleet became a single, solid continent of fire. For the soldiers trapped inside, the choices were horrific. You can stay on the ship and burn to death, or you can jump into the water. But the water is no sanctuary. It is choked with debris, it is stained with oil, and it is swarming with Vietnamese soldiers who are spearing anything that surfaces. The riverbank is lined with archers raining arrows down into the smoke. There is literally nowhere to go. The invincible Mongol cavalry, the men who had ridden across the steppes and conquered empires, were reduced to screaming victims. Their heavy armor, once their greatest asset, became their death sentence. If they jumped, they sank like stones. If they stayed, they cooked inside their metal shells. The historical records describe the water of the Bạch Đằng River turning red, but that's almost too poetic. It was worse than that. The river was a slurry of mud, ash, and the broken bodies of an entire generation of warriors. General Omar, the man who had been so confident just hours before, was captured hiding in the reeds, wet and humiliated. Prince Togan, the son of the great Khan, only escaped by abandoning his ship, hiding in a brass pipe to avoid arrows, and fleeing through the jungle like a hunted animal. The destruction was absolute. 400 warships were lost. 80,000 men were removed from the census. The Battle of Bạch Đằng wasn't a victory, it was an erasure. The Mongol fleet didn't just retreat, it ceased to exist. The bill for hubris always comes due, and in 1288 the interest rate was lethal. The aftermath of Bạch Đằng wasn't a negotiation, it was a clean-up operation. The river was choked with the debris of an empire, shattered teak wood, silk banners floating in oil, and the bloated bodies of the Yuan elite. But the true brutality of this moment wasn't in the dead, it was in the living. General Omar, the man who had terrorized the coast of Vietnam, was fished out of the water alive. In most medieval wars, a high-ranking captive like him would be ransomed back for a chest of gold. But Trần Hưng Đạo wasn't interested in gold. He was interested in sending a message. He treated Omar with respect, allowing him to return to China. He even provided the boat, but there was a catch, literally. According to the historical chronicles, the boat provided for Omar had been carefully sabotaged. The Vietnamese engineers, the same ones who built the stake trap, had drilled holes in the hull and plugged them with water-soluble stoppers. As Omar sailed out to sea, thinking he had survived the impossible, the plugs dissolved. The boat sank. There were no survivors. It was a cold-blooded, mafia-style execution disguised as a tragic accident. Trần Hưng Đạo wanted Kublai Khan to know that not even surrender would guarantee safety. For Prince Togan, the fate was arguably worse than death. He managed to escape the slaughter, fleeing overland through the dense jungle. Historical accounts paint a pathetic picture of the son of heaven's son hiding in a bronze tube to avoid poisoned arrows, dragged through the mud by his few remaining guards. When he finally limped back to the Chinese border, he wasn't greeted with parades, he was greeted with silence. Kublai Khan, the ruler of half the world, was waiting in Beijing. When he heard the news that his invincible fleet had been turned into firewood and his army annihilated by a barbarian kingdom half the size of one of his provinces, he didn't explode in rage. He went cold. He banished Togan from the capital for life. He refused to even look at his own son. To Kublai, Togan was no longer a prince. He was a living reminder of the empire's first true, irreversible humiliation. The defeat at Bạch Đằng broke something in the Mongols' psyche. They had lost battles before, but they had never been completely dismantled like this. The Vietnam campaign was officially abandoned. The scalded dog fears the boiling water, and the Mongols never returned to Đại Việt. They looked at the map, saw that thin strip of land in the south, and decided that the cost of conquering it was simply too high. The wooden stakes had done what the armies of Europe and the Middle East could not. They drew a line in the blood-soaked mud that the Mongol Empire could not cross. So, why don't we talk about the Battle of Bạch Đằng? Why isn't Trần Hưng Đạo a household name alongside Napoleon or Hannibal? Perhaps it's because history has a bias toward empires. We like stories about maps getting painted one color. We like the narrative of the unstoppable juggernaut. But Bạch Đằng is the opposite of that. It is a story about a jagged, uncomfortable rock that broke the gears of the machine. It is a reminder that inevitability is a myth. The Mongols were inevitable until they weren't. They were the masters of the world until they hit a river that knew how to fight back. The legacy of this battle echoes far beyond the 13th century. It established a blueprint for Vietnamese military doctrine that would last for 700 years. The strategy of People's War, of abandoning the cities, melting into the countryside, and using the geography to bleed a superior enemy dry, didn't start in the 20th century. It started here. The Mongols were just the first superpower to learn the hard way that you cannot conquer a people who treat their own land as a weapon. Whether it's wooden stakes in 1288 or tunnels in 1968, the lesson remains the brutal same. Technology and numbers mean nothing if you are fighting in a kill box designed by nature itself. Trần Hưng Đạo died in 1300, a national hero. He left behind a manual on warfare, but his real legacy is the psychological immunity he gave his people. He proved that the apocalypse could be cancelled. He showed that if you remain calm while the rest of the world is panicking, and if you are willing to do the hard, dirty work of driving iron into the mud, while the tide is out, you can sink giants. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal engineering of medieval warfare, please help us win our own battle against the algorithm by hitting that like button and subscribing. It really does make a difference in keeping these forgotten stories alive. And check out the video on your screen now to see how another invincible empire was destroyed by its own arrogance. And I want to hear from you. Do you think the Mongol Empire collapsed because it overextended itself? Or was it simply impossible for a steppe army to conquer the tropics? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a warning for the future.